The Captive's Lament. Varric sat in the cold, dark corner of the cell, its slender, silver-scaled body trembling with exhaustion. The walls of the prison were made of an unbreakable alloy, shimmering faintly under the dull green glow of the overhead lights. Every so often, the ship would hum as the Zoreth Dominion's massive engines roared, carrying it deeper into the void of space. For Varric, each hum felt like a countdown to its end. It had been weeks, perhaps months, since Varric was captured. Time had lost meaning in this place of endless torment. The Zoreth were relentless, their interrogations brutal. Varric was a Yelthin, a peaceful being whose people had no concept of war. The Yelthin relied on their natural empathy and intelligence to resolve conflicts. Yet here it was, trapped among creatures who thrived on violence and power. "Tell us where the council hides," the Zoreth commander had snarled during the last interrogation. Varric had no answer to give. The council never shared their secrets with civilians. Still, the Zoreth did not care. They wanted the location of the Yelthin leadership, and they were determined to break Varric to get it. Now, alone in the silence of the cell, Varric felt the weight of despair. Its elongated fingers traced the faint scars on its arms, marks of the Zoreth's cruel machines. Varric thought of its homeworld, a lush planet of floating islands and golden skies. It was a place of harmony, where the Yelthin spent their days creating art, studying the cosmos, and nurturing life. The memory of home was both a comfort and a torment. Would it ever see those skies again? A sudden noise broke the silence, a distant alarm. Varric lifted its head, its large, luminescent eyes narrowing. The sound was unfamiliar, unlike the usual ship alerts. It grew louder, accompanied by the distant rumble of explosions. Something was happening. The door to the cell remained sealed, but Varric's sharp ears picked up hurried footsteps outside. Voices barked orders, but the language was a mix of Zoreth and something else. The ship's usual oppressive rhythm had changed. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope stirred within Varric. Could it be a rescue? No, the Yelthin did not have warriors. Perhaps another faction had come to challenge the Zoreth. Whoever it was, their actions were causing chaos, and chaos might mean an opportunity. The cell's small viewport vibrated as another explosion rocked the ship. Varric stood shakily, its legs weak from malnourishment. It pressed its face against the viewport, peering into the dimly lit corridor beyond. Shadows moved, figures running, weapons drawn. A loud clanging sound jolted Varric backward. The cell door's control panel sparked, and with a hiss, the door slid open. Blinking against the sudden flood of light, Varric froze as a figure stepped inside. It was not Zoreth. The figure was tall, clad in dark, armored clothing that looked battered but functional. A helmet covered its face, but the stance and size were unmistakable. It was human. "You're not Zoreth," the human said, voice distorted slightly by the helmet's communicator. The words were in Galactic Standard, the common language of the known universe. The human's tone was cautious but not unkind. Varric nodded slowly, too stunned to speak. It had heard stories of humans, fierce and unpredictable beings who often surprised the galaxy with their courage and defiance. But to see one here, standing in defiance of the Zoreth, was something entirely different. The human glanced around quickly, as if expecting an ambush. "Can you walk?" "Yes," Varric managed to whisper, though its voice was hoarse from lack of use. "Good. We don't have much time." The human reached out a gloved hand, and after a brief hesitation, Varric took it. The warmth of the touch was unexpected, a stark contrast to the icy chill of the cell. As they stepped into the corridor, chaos surrounded them. Zoreth guards were shouting orders, and the sound of blaster fire echoed through the halls. The human moved with precision, leading Varric through the labyrinth of the ship. "Why? Why are you helping me?" Varric asked as they ducked behind a crate to avoid a patrol. The human turned, and though the helmet concealed their expression, their voice carried a faint smile. "Let's just say I don't like bullies." And the Zorath. They're the worst kind. Varix's chest tightened, a mix of gratitude and disbelief. It had been so long since anyone showed it kindness. The pair continued, the human using gadgets and sheer skill to bypass security systems. Varix, though weak, began to feel a spark of determination. If this human could risk so much for a stranger, perhaps there was still hope in the galaxy. As they reached a junction, the human paused. Name's Elias Thorne, by the way, they said, glancing back at Varix. Varix, it replied softly. Well, Varix, stick close. Things are about to get messy. Another explosion rocked the ship, and alarms blared louder. Varix didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in weeks, it felt a glimmer of something it thought it had lost forever. Hope. A human storm. The Zorath prison ship trembled violently as explosions tore through its massive hull. Warning sirens blared in every corridor, their shrill tones mingling with the chaotic shouts of Zorath soldiers scrambling to respond to the attack. The air was thick with tension, and the once unyielding grip of the Zorath Dominion on their captives seemed to falter. Amid the pandemonium, Elias Thorne moved like a shadow. Clad in an advanced infiltration suit with a sleek black helmet, he was a stark contrast to the hulking Zorath soldiers. His armor, though battle-worn, was equipped with cutting-edge human technology, stealth systems, enhanced vision, and a compact arsenal of tools that made him a one-man army. Elias's heart raced, but his mind remained sharp. This was not his first raid, but it was his boldest yet. His mission was clear: infiltrate the Zorath prison ship, retrieve critical intelligence from their central command, and disable their tracking systems. What wasn't in the plan was stumbling across an alien prisoner. After freeing Varix from the cell, Elias had no time for explanations. He had to keep moving. The Zorath would regroup quickly, and every second counted. Stay close, Elias muttered, his voice steady but urgent as he led Varix through the dimly lit corridors. Varix struggled to keep up, its frail body still recovering from weeks of torture and starvation. But something about Elias's presence, his confidence, his unwavering focus, sparked a faint strength within the Yelthin. As they turned a corner, Elias stopped abruptly, raising a hand to signal silence. Varix froze, watching as Elias pulled a small device from his belt. The device emitted a faint hum, scanning the corridor ahead. "Patrol," Elias whispered. Seconds later, heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. Zorath soldiers, armed and armored, marched in formation. Their reptilian features were illuminated by the green glow of their weapons, their sharp eyes scanning for intruders. Elias pressed himself against the wall, gesturing for Varix to do the same. The Yelthin obeyed, its breathing shallow as fear gripped its chest. The soldiers stopped near an intersection, barking commands in their guttural language. Elias studied their movements, calculating his next move. "We can't fight them head-on," Elias muttered under his breath. His eyes darted to a maintenance hatch a few meters away. "We'll take the vents." Quietly. Varix nodded, though the idea of crawling through a confined space was far from appealing. Still, it trusted Elias more than it feared the alternative. Elias activated a small plasma cutter, slicing through the hatch's lock. The panel fell open with a soft clang, and Elias motioned for Varix to go first. "Hurry," he urged. Varix climbed into the narrow shaft, its long, slender body making it easier to maneuver. Elias followed, pulling the hatch shut behind them. The vent was cramped and stifling, but it was their best chance to avoid detection. As they crawled through the ducts, Varix couldn't help but ask, "Why are you here? Risking your life for this?" Elias hesitated for a moment before answering. "The Zorath took something from me. Someone. I'm not letting them do it to anyone else." His voice was calm, but there was a simmering anger beneath it, a pain that Varix recognized all too well. Before Varix could respond, a loud explosion shook the ship. The vent shuddered, and a section ahead of them collapsed, leaving a jagged gap. Smoke and debris filled the air, making it difficult to breathe. "Great," Elias muttered, peering through the gap. Below, a squad of Zorath soldiers rushed to contain the damage. "We'll have to jump," Elias said, his voice firm. "Stick close to me." "Ready?" Varrix's instincts screamed against the idea, but it nodded. There was no time to argue. Elias counted down. 3, 2, 1. They leaped from the vent, landing amidst the chaos. Elias moved instantly, his reflexes honed from years of combat. He pulled a small device from his belt, a flash grenade, and hurled it toward the soldiers. The grenade exploded in a blinding burst of light, disorienting the Zorath. Elias used the distraction to take down the nearest guard, his movements precise and lethal. Varrix watched in awe, its fear momentarily forgotten. This human, this lone figure, was standing against an empire that had crushed entire civilizations. "Move!" Elias shouted, snapping Varrix out of its thoughts. They sprinted through the smoke-filled corridor, dodging debris and stray blaster fire. Elias's suit absorbed a glancing hit, the impact sending a jolt through his body, but leaving him unharmed. Finally, they'd reached a secure room, an old storage area that Elias had scouted earlier. He sealed the door behind them, leaning against it to catch his breath. Varrix collapsed onto the floor, its chest heaving. It looked up at Elias, a mixture of gratitude and curiosity in its luminous eyes. Who are you?" Varrix asked, its voice trembling. Elias removed his helmet, revealing a rugged face with piercing green eyes. He ran a hand through his short, dark hair, his expression weary but resolute. "Like I said," Elias replied, "just someone who doesn't like bullies." The ship trembled again, a reminder that their ordeal was far from over. But for the first time, Varrix felt something it hadn't in weeks: safety. "Rest if you can," Elias said, checking his equipment. "We're not out of this yet." Varrix nodded, its gaze never leaving Elias. The human had risked everything to save it, and in doing so, had ignited a spark of hope that the Zorath couldn't extinguish. The Great Escape. The Zorath prison ship was a fortress, designed to hold some of the galaxy's most dangerous beings. Its corridors stretched endlessly, lined with reinforced walls, and patrolled by ruthless soldiers. For anyone else, escaping such a place would be impossible. But Elias Thorne wasn't just anyone, and now, with Varrix at his side, the stakes had never been higher. The storage room, where they had taken temporary refuge, was dark and cramped, filled with forgotten crates and obsolete equipment. Elias knelt beside a small terminal he had hacked moments earlier. His fingers moved quickly, navigating the Zorath's complex system to locate the fastest route to the escape pods. "Got it," Elias said, his voice a low whisper. "Pod bay is 2 decks down. Security's tight, but if we move fast, we can make it." Varrix, still catching its breath, looked up at him. Its silver eyes reflected a flicker of uncertainty. "What if they find us before we get there?" Elias glanced at the alien, his expression softening. "Then we fight. But I don't plan on getting caught. Stick with me, and we'll get through this." The reassurance wasn't just for Varrix. It was for himself, too. He'd been in tight spots before, but this was different. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for someone else's freedom. The moment they stepped back into the corridor, the air felt heavier, the tension palpable. The ship's alarms had intensified, their shrill tones piercing through the chaos. Zorath soldiers moved in coordinated units, their guttural voices barking orders as they swept the area. Elias motioned for Varrix to follow, keeping low as they moved toward the service elevator. He kept his weapon ready, a compact but powerful plasma pistol, while his other hand held a scanner to track enemy movements. They reached the elevator without incident, but the terminal next to it flashed red. The elevator was locked down. "Figures," Elias muttered, pulling a small device from his belt. "This'll take a minute." As Elias worked to override the lock, Varrix stood watch, Its heightened senses on high alert. The Yelthin species had an uncanny ability to detect subtle changes in their surroundings, shifts in air pressure, faint vibrations, the scent of fear. A sudden tremor ran through the floor, faint but distinct. "Elias," Varix whispered urgently. "They're coming." Elias cursed under his breath. "Keep calm." Almost there. The sound of boots echoed down the corridor, growing louder with each passing second. Varix's heart pounded as it glanced between Elias and the approaching shadows. "Done," Elias exclaimed, the terminal flashing green as the elevator doors slid open. They rushed inside, and Elias slammed the button for the lower deck. The doors closed just as the first Zorath soldiers appeared at the far end of the corridor. "Too close," Elias muttered, leaning against the wall. Varix nodded, its breathing shallow. "Thank you," it said softly. Elias glanced at the alien. "Save it for when we're out of here." The elevator descended, but their reprieve was short-lived. The Zorath had locked down the ship, and their pursuers were relentless. By the time the elevator doors opened, a squad of soldiers was already waiting. "Get down," Elias barked, pulling Varix to the floor as plasma bolts sizzled past them. Elias returned fire with precision, each shot finding its mark. The Zorath soldiers were strong, but their bulky armor made them slow. Elias used their size against them, targeting weak points and using the narrow corridor to limit their movements. Varix watched in awe, its fear momentarily replaced by admiration. Elias moved like a force of nature, every action deliberate and effective. But as skilled as he was, the odds were overwhelming. "We need a distraction," Elias muttered, glancing around. His eyes landed on a row of power conduits running along the ceiling. "Varix, can you reach those?" Varix followed his gaze, understanding immediately. Its slender form and long limbs made it more agile than any human. Without hesitation, it climbed onto a nearby crate and reached for the conduits. The Zorath soldiers hesitated, unsure how to react. That hesitation cost them. Varix yanked the conduits free, sending a shower of sparks cascading down. The lights flickered, and the corridor was plunged into chaos as systems overloaded. "Perfect," Elias shouted, grabbing Varix's hand and pulling it back to the ground. "Now run." They sprinted through the smoke-filled corridor, the sound of explosions and shouts fading behind them. The chaos Varix had created gave them just enough of a head start to reach the escape pod bay. The pod bay doors loomed ahead, a massive barrier standing between them and freedom. Elias scanned the area, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a terminal. "Cover me," he said, rushing to the console. Varix, still clutching the stolen plasma pistol Elias had given it, stood guard. It wasn't a fighter, but it was determined to protect the human who had risked so much for it. The terminal screen flashed as Elias worked to unlock the pod bay doors. His fingers flew across the interface, overriding Zorath protocols with practiced ease. Just as the doors began to open, the floor trembled violently. A new figure stepped into the bay, a Zorath elite guard. Clad in black armor with glowing red accents, the guard exuded menace. "Go," Elias shouted, stepping between Varix and the approaching threat. The elite guard charged, its weapon crackling with energy. Elias met the attack head-on, dodging the first swing and firing a shot that glanced off the guard's armor. Varix watched in horror as the two clashed. Elias fought with everything he had, using speed and cunning to outmaneuver the larger opponent. But the elite guard was relentless, each strike of its weapon sending sparks flying. Summoning its courage, Varix raised the plasma pistol and fired. The shot hit the guard's exposed side, staggering it just long enough for Elias to deliver a decisive blow. The guard collapsed, and Elias turned to Varix, a faint smile on his bloodied face. "Nice shot." The pod bay doors finished opening, revealing a row of escape pods. Elias and Varix rushed to the nearest one, sealing the hatch behind them. As the pod launched into the void, the prison ship shrank in the distance. For the first time, Freedom felt within reach. But the tracker light blinking on the pod's console told a different story. Their escape was far from over. Courage in the face of fear. The escape pod hurtled through the void of space, its engines humming faintly as it weaved between the debris fields scattered in the Zorath Dominion sector. Inside the cramped vessel, Elias Thorne worked furiously at the console, his fingers flying across the controls. Every warning light seemed to pulse with urgency, each beep a reminder of their peril. "We've got a tracker on us," Elias said, his tone grim but focused. Varric sat in the co-pilot's seat, its silver eyes wide with alarm. The Yelthin had never been in a spacecraft, let alone one under pursuit. "What does that mean? Can they find us?" Elias glanced at the alien. "Not just find us. They'll send everything they've got to make sure we don't get far." The pod jolted suddenly, throwing Varric against the restraints. Through the viewport, 2 Zorath fighters appeared, sleek and menacing, their weapons glowing with lethal intent. "They're here," Varric whispered, its voice trembling. Elias gritted his teeth. "Hold on." With a flick of a switch, the pod veered sharply to the right, narrowly avoiding the first volley of plasma fire. The fighters pursued relentlessly, their shots lighting up the darkness like a deadly fireworks display. Elias maneuvered the pod with precision, using every ounce of his piloting skills to stay one step ahead. Varric clung to the armrests, its heart pounding. "Can we outrun them?" "Not in this thing," Elias admitted. "Escape pods aren't built for speed or combat." The pod shook violently as a plasma bolt grazed its side, sparks flying from the damaged hull. Elias swore under his breath, his mind racing for a solution. "Listen," he said, glancing at Varric. "We're not getting out of this unless we work together. Can you handle that?" Varric hesitated, its fear threatening to overwhelm it. But then it looked at Elias, this human who had risked everything to save it, who now fought not just for himself but for both of them. Summoning a courage it didn't know it possessed, Varric nodded. "What do you need me to do?" Elias's lips curled into a faint smile. "Good. Take that console," he said, pointing to a set of controls on the co-pilot's side. "That's our defense system. Limited, but it's something. Aim for their engines and fire when I say." Varric slid into position, its slender fingers hovering over the controls. The interface was alien to it, but the symbols were intuitive enough. "Ready." "Here they come," Elias said, his voice steady despite the chaos. The fighters swooped in for another attack, their weapons glowing ominously. Elias rolled the pod, dodging the first barrage, and shouted, "Now, Varric." Varric pressed the trigger, and a burst of energy shot from the pod's turrets. The beam struck one of the fighters, hitting its wing and sending it spiraling out of control. "I hit it," Varric exclaimed, a mix of shock and exhilaration. "Don't celebrate yet," Elias said, pulling the pod into a steep dive to avoid the remaining fighter. The Zorath pilot was relentless, sticking close to the pod and firing with deadly precision. Elias executed a series of sharp maneuvers, each one throwing Varric against the restraints. "I can't get a clear shot," Varric shouted, panic creeping back into its voice. "You will," Elias said firmly. "Trust me." He led the pursuing fighter into an asteroid field, weaving between the massive, tumbling rocks. The Zorath pilot followed, confident in their advanced ship's capabilities. But Elias knew the terrain better than they did. "Wait for it," Elias muttered, his eyes locked on the console. The fighter closed in, its weapons charging for a final strike. At the last second, Elias pulled the pod into a sharp climb, narrowly avoiding a massive asteroid. The fighter wasn't as lucky. It collided with the rock, exploding in a brilliant flash of light. "That's 2 down," Elias said, letting out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Varric slumped back in the seat, its hands shaking. You did it." "No," Elias said, glancing at Varric. "We did it." Before either of them could catch their breath, The pod's console lit up with a new warning. A massive Zoreth battleship loomed on the horizon, its silhouette blotting out the stars. Varrix's heart sank. What now? Elias's jaw tightened. We're out of options. That ship has enough firepower to vaporize us in seconds. Varrix stared at him, its fear replaced by determination. There must be something we can do. Elias hesitated, then reached into a compartment beneath his seat. He pulled out a small cylindrical device with glowing blue lines etched into its surface. This is a cloaking module, he explained. Experimental tech. It'll make us invisible, but only for a short time. Long enough to get past them, if it works. And if it doesn't? Varrix asked. Elias met its gaze, his expression serious. Then this is the end of the line. Varrix took a deep breath, its resolve hardening. Let's try. Elias nodded and activated the device. The pod shimmered briefly before disappearing from view. The battleship's scanners swept the area, but the cloaking field held. As the pod slipped past the massive ship, Varrix looked out the viewport, its mind racing. It had faced death so many times in the past weeks, but this time felt different. This time, it wasn't alone. The cloaking field flickered just as they cleared the ship's range. Elias powered the engines, putting as much distance as possible between them and the Zoreth. We're clear, for now, he said, leaning back in his seat. Varrix exhaled, its body trembling with relief. Thank you, Elias. I wouldn't have made it without you. Elias glanced at the Yelthin, a faint smile playing on his lips. You did more than you think. You've got more courage in you than most people I've met. Varrix looked out at the stars, its fear slowly giving way to something new, hope. For the first time in weeks, it felt like freedom was within reach. A desperate chase. The stars blurred as the escape pod tore through the void, its engines straining under the relentless pace Elias had set. Behind them, the looming shadow of the Zoreth battleship grew smaller but no less threatening. Every flicker on the console, every distant ping of a tracking signal reminded them of the relentless pursuit that awaited. The Zoreth would not give up easily, not when one of their prisoners and a defiant human had slipped through their grasp. Elias adjusted the pod's course, his focus razor-sharp as he scanned for a safe haven. The pod's limited systems displayed a rough map of the surrounding sectors, but none of the nearby locations offered much comfort. Most were barren asteroid belts or abandoned outposts, the perfect places to be cornered. We can't outrun them forever, Elias muttered, his voice low but calm. Varrix sat beside him, its silver eyes darting between the console and the viewport. What happens if they catch us? Elias glanced at the Yelthin, his expression unreadable. They won't, he said firmly. Before Varrix could respond, the console emitted a sharp beep. Elias's face darkened as he read the incoming data. A squadron of Zoreth fighters had launched from the battleship, and they were closing in fast. 5 of them, Elias said, gripping the controls. They're spreading out to box us in. Varrix's chest tightened. What can we do? Elias adjusted the pod's trajectory, angling toward a dense asteroid field in the distance. The massive rocks tumbled through space, their jagged surfaces reflecting faint starlight. We use the terrain, Elias said. They'll have to follow us in. And if we're lucky, their arrogance will do the rest. The pod plunged into the asteroid field, weaving between the massive, spinning debris. The fighters followed close behind, their sleek forms darting effortlessly through the maze. Plasma bolts streaked past the pod, some grazing its hull and sending showers of sparks into the cockpit. Varrix, take the defense console, Elias barked. Aim for the asteroids near them, not the ships. Force them to react. Varrix nodded, its fingers trembling as they hovered over the controls. It had never fired a weapon before, but it trusted Elias. Taking a deep breath, it locked onto a large asteroid and fired. The shot struck true, shattering the rock into a cloud of debris that forced the nearest fighter to veer off course. Good shot, Elias said, a flicker of approval in his voice. Encouraged, Varix fired again, targeting another asteroid. This time, the debris clipped one of the fighters, sending it spinning into a larger rock. The resulting explosion lit up the asteroid field, briefly illuminating the pod's cockpit. "That's one down," Elias said. "Keep it up." The remaining fighters pressed on, their pilots adapting quickly to the dangerous environment. They began firing in coordinated bursts, forcing Elias to push the pod's engines to their limits. The craft groaned in protest, warning lights flashing as the strain mounted. "We can't take much more of this," Elias muttered. Varix, its fear momentarily forgotten, focused entirely on the task at hand. It fired with increasing precision, each shot forcing the fighters to adjust their trajectories. One fighter clipped an asteroid while dodging the pod's fire, its engines failing before it exploded in a fiery burst. "Two down," Elias said, his tone steady despite the chaos. But the remaining fighters were relentless. One managed to land a glancing hit on the pod's engine, causing a violent jolt that threw Varix against the restraints. "Elias," Varix shouted, panic creeping back into its voice. "Hold on," Elias growled, wrestling with the controls. The pod spun wildly before he managed to stabilize it, narrowly avoiding a collision with a massive asteroid. Elias's mind raced. The pod couldn't take another hit, and the fighters were too fast to outmaneuver for long. Then his eyes landed on a cluster of unusually dense asteroids ahead. A faint smile tugged at his lips. "I've got an idea," he said, "but it's risky." Varix looked at him, its fear giving way to determination. "What do you need me to do?" Elias pointed to a secondary console. "See that panel? It controls the pod's external coolant vents. I need you to release a burst when I say. It'll create a temporary cloud that might confuse their sensors." Varix nodded, sliding into position. "Tell me when." As the fighters closed in, Elias angled the pod toward the densest part of the asteroid field. The massive rocks spun dangerously close together, leaving little room for error. "Now," Elias shouted. Varix hit the release button, and a plume of coolant erupted from the pod, spreading into a shimmering cloud. The Zorath fighters hesitated, their sensors struggling to adjust. Elias used the momentary distraction to pull a sharp turn, leading one of the fighters directly into the path of an oncoming asteroid. The collision was immediate and devastating, reducing the ship to a cloud of debris. "That's three," Elias said, his voice laced with grim satisfaction. The remaining two fighters regrouped, their pilots more cautious now. But Elias wasn't done. He guided the pod into the narrowest part of the field, where the asteroid spun in unpredictable patterns. "This is going to get rough," Elias warned. Varix gripped the armrests, its trust in Elias unwavering. Elias's gambit paid off. One of the fighters misjudged the trajectory of an asteroid and was crushed between two massive rocks. The final fighter, realizing the danger, attempted to retreat, but Elias wasn't about to let it go. "Varix, one more shot," he said. Varix took aim, its hand steady despite the chaos. The shot struck a nearby asteroid, sending shards of rock into the fighter's path. The ship veered sharply but couldn't avoid the debris. It spiraled out of control before exploding. The asteroid field fell silent, save for the faint hum of the escape pod's engines. Elias exhaled deeply, his hands relaxing on the controls. "5 down," he said, a hint of relief in his voice. Varix looked at him, its silver eyes wide with awe. "You did it." Elias glanced at the Yelthin and shook his head. "We did it. Couldn't have done it without you." For a moment, they sat in silence, the tension slowly ebbing away. But the blinking light on the console reminded them of the battleship still out there. Their escape wasn't over yet. Hope amid despair. The escape pod drifted through the cold expanse of space, a fragile speck in the vast darkness. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The Zorath battleship had lost its fighters, but its menacing silhouette still loomed on the pod's scanner. Time was running out. Elias Thorne slumped back in his seat, exhaustion etched into his face. His hands were steady, but his sharp green eyes betrayed the weight of the situation. "They're still tracking us," he muttered, tapping the console to confirm the battleship's slow but steady approach. Varix, sitting beside him, had grown quieter since the dogfight. Its silver-scaled skin glistened faintly in the dim light, and its large eyes were fixed on the screen. "Can we get away?" it asked, its voice tinged with both hope and dread. Elias exhaled, leaning forward to study the pod's systems. "Our engines took a beating, and we're running low on fuel. If they don't destroy us, we'll run out of power long before we find safety." Varix's gaze dropped, the faint spark of hope it had felt earlier beginning to dim. It had trusted Elias, relied on his resourcefulness, but even the most courageous beings had their limits. "We're not giving up," Elias said firmly, his voice cutting through the silence. "Not now. Not after all this." Before Varix could respond, the console emitted a sharp beep. An object had appeared on the scanner, a small vessel heading toward them. Elias leaned forward, his expression darkening as he studied the readings. "It's not Zoreth," he said, relief washing over his face. "It's one of ours. Resistance." Varix tilted its head. "Resistance." Elias smirked faintly. "The people who don't roll over for empires like the Zoreth. If they're here, we might have a fighting chance." The resistance ship, a sleek and nimble frigate, drew closer, hailing the pod with a transmission. Elias quickly accepted the signal, and a woman's voice crackled through the speakers. "Elias Thorne, you reckless bastard," the voice said, half amused, half annoyed. "What mess have you gotten yourself into this time?" Elias chuckled, his first genuine smile in hours. "Good to hear your voice, Commander Vega. I've got a guest on board and a Zoreth battleship on my tail. Think you can help?" The screen flickered to reveal Commander Vega, a sharp-featured woman with short, dark hair and an air of authority. Her eyes narrowed as she assessed the situation. "You're lucky we were nearby. Bring your pod into our hangar. We'll handle the rest." As the resistance frigate extended its docking bay, the escape pod systems began to falter. The engines sputtered, and warning lights flashed across the console. "Come on, hold together," Elias muttered, gripping the controls. Varix clutched the armrests, its body tense as the pod shuddered violently. "Will we make it?" Elias didn't answer, his focus entirely on maneuvering the pod. The frigate loomed closer, its hangar doors opening like the jaws of a waiting savior. With one final burst of power, the pod slid into the docking bay, its systems failing just as the hangar doors sealed shut. The moment the pod landed, Elias unbuckled his restraints and turned to Varix. "Stay close. These people are on our side, but they're not used to seeing someone like you." Varix nodded, its expression a mix of gratitude and nervousness. As the pod's hatch opened, a squad of resistance fighters greeted them, weapons drawn but not hostile. Commander Vega stepped forward, her sharp eyes studying Elias and his alien companion. "Who's your friend?" Vega asked, her tone cautious but curious. "This is Varix," Elias said, stepping aside to let the Yelthin emerge. "A Zoreth prisoner. They'd been through hell, and they helped me survive. We owe them our lives." Vega's gaze softened slightly as she looked at Varix. "Welcome aboard. You're safe here, for now." The frigate shuddered as the Zoreth battleship drew closer, its weapons locking onto the smaller vessel. Vega's demeanor shifted instantly, her voice snapping with authority. "Get to the bridge. We're not done yet." Elias and Varix followed Vega through the ship's corridors, the hum of the engines growing louder as the crew prepared for battle. Resistance fighters moved with precision, manning stations and arming defenses. On the bridge, the view of the Zoreth battleship filled the main screen. It was a hulking beast of a vessel, bristling with weaponry and nearly impervious to conventional attacks. "They'll tear us apart if we stay here," Vega said, her hands gripping the command console. "But if we run, They'll track us to the resistance base. Elias frowned, his mind racing. What about the cloaking module? We used it on the pod. Can you replicate it on the ship? Vega hesitated. We can try, but it'll take time. And time's not something we have. I'll buy you time, Elias said, his voice steady. Varix turned to him, alarmed. What are you saying? Elias placed a hand on Varix's shoulder. I'll take a fighter out there, draw their fire. They'll focus on me, and you'll have the window you need to cloak the ship. No, Varix said firmly. You can't face them alone. Not after everything you've done for me. Elias smiled faintly. It's not just about you, Varix. It's about everyone the Zorath have heard. If I can give them a chance to fight back, it's worth it. Before Varix could argue further, Vega spoke up. If you're doing this, you're taking backup. A resistance fighter handed Elias a flight suit, and he suited up quickly. Varix watched silently, its chest tight with emotions it couldn't fully understand. As Elias headed for the hangar, Varix followed, determined not to let the human face the Zorath alone. Varix, Elias said, his tone soft but firm. Stay here. You've done more than enough. No, Varix said, its voice unwavering. You said we're in this together. I won't abandon you now. Elias hesitated, then nodded. All right, let's give them hell. The frigate's hangar doors opened, and Elias and Varix launched into the void, ready to face the Zorath one final time. A new beginning. The void of space erupted into chaos as Elias Thorne's fighter sped toward the Zorath battleship, flanked by a squadron of resistance ships. Plasma bolts streaked across the darkness, illuminating the battlefield like a storm of fire and light. Each moment was a gamble, a dance between survival and annihilation. Elias's voice crackled over the comms. We'll draw their fire. Vega, get that cloaking system online before they target the frigate. On board the resistance frigate, Commander Vega barked orders to her crew, her sharp gaze fixed on the tactical display. The ship's engineers worked feverishly to integrate the cloaking module, sparks flying as they pushed the aging vessel to its limits. Meanwhile, in Elias's fighter, Varix sat in the co-pilot's seat, its silver-scaled hands gripping the controls tightly. The Yelthan's luminous eyes darted between the targeting systems and the chaotic battle outside. Elias, Varix said, its voice steady despite the fear pounding in its chest. Why do you fight like this? Risk everything for people you don't even know. Elias maneuvered the ship through a barrage of enemy fire, his jaw clenched with focus. Because someone has to, he said simply. The Zorath think they can crush anyone who doesn't fall in line, but every act of defiance shows them they're wrong, that they can't control everyone. Varix nodded, the weight of his words settling over it. The Zorath had broken its spirit once, but here, alongside Elias, it felt something new. Purpose. The battleship loomed larger as they closed the distance. Its turrets swiveled, unleashing a storm of plasma fire that forced Elias to weave through an impossible gauntlet. Resistance fighters flanked the Zorath ship, attacking weak points and drawing its attention away from the frigate. Varix, Elias said, his voice calm but urgent, I need you to target the battleship's secondary reactor. If we can disable it, we'll buy Vega the time she needs. Varix hesitated for only a moment before locking onto the reactor. Its hands trembled as it adjusted the targeting scope. Got it, it said. Elias banked sharply, giving Varix a clear shot. Now. Varix fired, and the plasma bolt streaked toward the reactor. The impact was immediate, sending a shockwave rippling across the battleship's hull. Secondary explosions erupted along its surface, and several of its turrets fell silent. Direct hit, Elias shouted. Nice work, Varix. The comms crackled as Vega's voice cut through. Cloaking system is online. We're activating now. On the resistance frigate, the ship shimmered and vanished from the battlefield, its cloaking system rendering it invisible to the Zorath sensors. Elias let out a breath of relief, but the battleship wasn't done yet. A massive turret on its dorsal side swiveled toward his fighter, its barrel glowing ominously. "They're locking onto us," Varric said, its voice tight with fear. "I see it," Elias replied, pulling the fighter into a steep climb. The turret fired, missing by inches, but the energy burst disrupted the fighter's systems. Warning lights flashed across the console, and the ship shuddered violently. "Engines are failing," Varric shouted. Elias gritted his teeth, his hands steady on the controls. "Hold on." The fighter spun out of control, hurtling toward the battleship. Elias wrestled with the controls, managing to stabilize the ship just enough to avoid a direct collision. The fighter skimmed the battleship's hull, its shields barely holding as they scraped past turrets and protrusions. "We're not gonna make it," Varric whispered, its voice trembling. "Yes, we will," Elias said firmly. His gaze flicked to the escape systems lever. "But you might need to trust me one more time." Before Varric could protest, Elias yanked the lever, and the cockpit canopy blew open. The force of the ejection threw them into the cold void, their emergency suits activating automatically. Behind them, the fighter slammed into the battleship's surface, exploding in a brilliant flash of light. The two drifted in space, tethered together by a lifeline. The Zorath battleship, damaged and disoriented, began to retreat, its remaining systems faltering. The resistance frigate, cloaked and unharmed, moved silently to intercept Elias and Varric. When the frigate's airlock opened to bring them on board, the crew cheered. Elias and Varric, battered but alive, were helped into the ship. Commander Vega met them in the hangar, her expression a mix of relief and exasperation. "You never do things the easy way, do you, Thorn?" Elias grinned despite the exhaustion in his eyes. "Where's the fun in that?" Varric stood beside him, its silver eyes reflecting the light of the hangar. You saved me," it said quietly. "Again." Elias looked at the Yelthin, his expression softening. "You saved me too. Don't forget that." In the days that followed, Varric began to integrate with the Resistance crew. It shared knowledge of the Zorath's tactics and vulnerabilities, becoming an invaluable ally. For the first time since its capture, it felt like it belonged somewhere. One evening, as the frigate drifted through a quiet sector of space, Elias found Varric in the observation deck, staring out at the stars. "Thinking about home?" Elias asked, stepping beside it. Varric nodded. "Yes, but also about what's next. I want to fight, to help others the way you helped me." Elias smiled, his green eyes reflecting the starlight. "Then you're in the right place. We'll take it one battle at a time." The two stood in silence, the stars stretching infinitely before them. For Varric, the journey was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like the beginning of something worth fighting for.